Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary bedrooms of medieval royalty, where power, lust, and absolutely no concept of boundaries collided in spectacular fashion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. King John of England, also known as John Lackland, and informally, the worst dinner guest in British history, is best remembered for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and somehow still finding time to be wildly inappropriate with most of the nobility's daughters. John's reign, 1199 to 1216, was a masterclass in how not to behave in public office. Politically, a disaster. Personally, somehow worse. John didn't just take lovers, he took them. He was notorious for kidnapping noblewomen, imprisoning them in royal castles, and entertaining them until they were either married off elsewhere or conveniently forgotten. His favourite technique for breaking up powerful families wasn't battle. It was seducing the wife, alienating the husband, and then charging him double taxes. Efficient. Chroniclers were so uncomfortable with John's behaviour that even biased medieval scribes, people who routinely ignored witch trials and floggings, wrote things like, "He was not temperate with women," and "He did not abstain from wives and daughters." That's medieval for, "He made the Christmas party deeply awkward." At one point, John reportedly had 30 mistresses on official record. That's not romantic, that's a staffing issue. Several nobles complained directly to the crown that John was abusing their hospitality, which is a polite way of saying he slept with everyone, including the serving staff, and possibly the family goat. His behaviour was so bad, it nearly started a rebellion. Not because of taxation or war, but because half the barons were afraid to leave their wives unattended during royal visits. One baron refused to meet John unless his entire household was locked up first. That's diplomacy, 13th century style. And yet, in true royal fashion, John never saw a problem. He considered himself irresistible. There's no evidence for this outside of his own letters, but when you're king, delusion comes standard. In the end, King John left behind a kingdom in turmoil, a legacy of distrust, and possibly several children no one talked about at court. He was the kind of king who made people invent democracy, just to keep him away from their families. Not the worst monarch in history, but definitely the one you'd never let babysit. Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled from 1380 to 1422. And yes, that nickname was earned, not given lightly at a drunken banquet. He began his reign with promise, young, handsome, capable. Then things took a turn. He started forgetting who he was, attacking his own knights, and at one point believed he was made of glass, insisting his servants wrap him in blankets so he wouldn't shatter while walking. Not exactly the image of kingly strength, but impressive in terms of creative paranoia. Now, most kings who believe they are fragile glass figurines usually avoid scandal. Not Charles. He somehow managed to juggle a royal mistress, a paranoid delusion, and civil war all at once. A multitasker. His long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to manage the court, while Charles did things like run screaming from mirrors and refused to bathe for fear the water might dissolve him. Meanwhile, his mistress, Odette de Champdivers, was quietly moved into the palace, introduced to everyone as his comfort, which was medieval code for "don't ask questions, just smile." Odette, for her part, stayed with Charles during his most unhinged years. She must have had the patience of a saint or the property rights of a queen. She reportedly brushed his hair, listened to his glass-based ramblings, and helped him put on multiple layers of padded clothes so he could sit down safely. Nothing says passion like strapping your royal lover into a pillow suit. But Charles wasn't just eccentric behind closed doors. He also hosted court entertainments where things went horribly wrong. During one infamous event known as the Bal des Ardents, he and his friends dressed as wild men in flammable costumes and danced around with torches. Naturally, someone dropped a flame, and several of them burned alive. Charles survived, but his dignity did not. Despite everything, Charles fathered 12 children, several during episodes of apparent lucidity, or at least, enough lucidity. Royal chronicles don't clarify whether he remembered their names, but one can assume that naming a child not made of glass was discouraged. Charles VI ruled France into ruin, but more impressively, he managed to make mental illness, royal scandal, and medieval pyrotechnics all part of the same tragicomic package. And somehow, they still let him wear a crown. Peter the Cruel, also known as Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were with him or under a floorboard because of him, ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369. His idea of romance was a curious blend of royal charm, obsessive jealousy, and the occasional politically inconvenient murder. His early love life wasn't exactly Shakespearean. He fell for a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla, whom he may or may not have married in secret. The secrecy part is key, mostly because he was also being married off to other women for alliances, which made things slightly awkward. One of those women was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman he married, then locked in a castle 3 days later. She spent the rest of her life imprisoned because Peter decided Maria had prettier hair. Or maybe he just didn't like Blanche's accent. Either way, it was an aggressive form of ghosting. Maria, meanwhile, became his lifelong obsession. Even when he married other women, she remained his favourite. When she died, Peter reportedly wept for days, and then ordered that she be declared his legal wife retroactively, just to confuse everyone, and possibly to justify the fact that she had already given birth to 4 of his children. But Peter's passions didn't stop at unannounced annulments and royal kidnapping. He was known for falling in love violently, which is not poetic. It's just dangerous. One of his mistresses, Doña Juana, tried to leave him. She was later found in pieces, as were several of his political enemies and cousins, and occasionally people who made eye contact at the wrong moment. Contemporary accounts mention that Peter sometimes watched executions from his balcony while lounging with a mistress. That's not charming sociopath. That's HBO villain with poor impulse control. But even with all the drama, the Castilian court was never boring. Gossip flowed faster than wine, and Peter's relationships blurred the line between passion and vendetta. His idea of romantic gestures included surprise weddings, surprise divorces, and the occasional surprise stabbing. Eventually, Peter was killed by his own half-brother in a rather symbolic act of family therapy. But his reputation as one of Europe's most aggressively unromantic romantics lives on. If love is a battlefield, Peter brought siege equipment. Edward II of England ruled from 1307 to 1327, and is best remembered for 2 things: losing to the Scots at Bannockburn and showing more affection to his male favourites than to his actual queen. One of those things was considered treason. The other was considered controversial dinner conversation. Let's begin with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood companion, rumoured lover and full-time fashion icon. Piers wasn't just close to Edward. He was elevated to positions of ridiculous influence, gifted estates, titles and jewellery that frankly matched none of his outfits. At Edward's coronation, Piers wore more sparkle than the royal regalia and upstaged the Queen, which is a bold move when your survival depends on nobles not hating you. Spoiler: they hated him. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was understandably furious. She came with political expectations and a generous dowry, neither of which included sharing the throne with her husband's bestie/possible boyfriend. Edward, however, remained devoted. When the nobles demanded Piers be exiled, Edward sulked, sent him away, then brought him right back. Like a teenage breakup, but with castles and crossbows. Eventually, the barons had enough and executed Piers. Edward was devastated. Think full-on royal meltdown. Mourning clothes, public weeping, the whole medieval soap opera. His grief, however, did not lead to self-reflection. It just made room for a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh made Piers look like a subtle footnote. He wasn't just Edward's advisor, he was basically the second king. Land, titles, entire counties, Hugh got them. The rest of the nobility got angry. Isabella by this point switched from annoyed wife to full-blown vengeance avatar. She teamed up with a lover of her own, Edward's enemy naturally, invaded England and overthrew her husband. Edward was imprisoned, stripped of his crown, and possibly murdered by red-hot poker. Yes, that rumour exists. No, we're not discussing the physics of it. Let's just say, medieval revenge was rarely subtle. Edward II's reign was less about governance and more about personal drama so intense it could be a reality show. If the Plantagenets had Netflix, his season would have been banned in 3 countries. His mistake? Mixing politics with passion, ignoring everyone else, and assuming royal power meant nobody could touch him. Turns out, everyone could. Eventually. Wenceslaus of Bohemia ruled in the late 14th century, though ruled might be a generous term. He technically held titles like King of the Romans and King of Bohemia. But his real achievements were more along the lines of public nudity, aggressive drinking, and starting fights in his own palace. If you're thinking of good King Wenceslaus from the Christmas Carol, wrong guy. That was his ancestor. This Wenceslaus? Not good. Not even vaguely decent. He began with promise, crowned as a teenager, intelligent, multilingual, and capable. But somewhere along the way, he decided the royal wine cellar was more useful than the treasury, and started governing from the bottom of a goblet. Wenceslaus developed a reputation for hosting multi-day drinking sessions, where policy decisions were made between rounds of mead and inappropriate limericks. His advisers began carrying flasks, not to drink, but to survive negotiations. At court, debates often ended with someone flipping a table or being challenged to a duel using breadsticks. He also developed the charming habit of streaking through the castle, sometimes mid-meeting. One chronicler records Wenceslaus delivering royal edicts completely naked, except for a sword belt. His justification? Clothes are for the timid. Hard to argue with that kind of logic, when the guy with the crown also has a longsword and no pants. Romantically, he favoured barmaids, laundresses, and occasionally nobles' wives, though he seemed more invested in their beer recommendations than their feelings. Affairs weren't scandalous at his court. They were practically job interviews. One noble accused him of seducing his sister. Wenceslaus shrugged and offered him a drink. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire decided they'd had enough of his royal vodka and removed him as King of the Romans, a polite way of saying, "You're fired, but we're pretending it's political." Even his own brother called him useless, undressed, and usually unconscious. Still, Wenceslaus somehow reigned in Bohemia for decades. His people tolerated him the way one tolerates a loud uncle at a wedding, with eye rolls, careful seating plans, and lots of alcohol. In the end, he left behind a shaky kingdom, a flooded wine cellar, and a royal legacy best summed up as, he ruled like every day was his last hangover. Henry VIII of England is what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked hormones. He ruled from 1509 to 1547, and spent most of it either getting married, getting divorced, or getting mad at the Pope for not supporting his questionable dating decisions. You've heard the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that barely scratches the surface of Henry's royal rom-com turned horror series. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, wife number 1. After 20 years of marriage, Henry decided God was mad at him for not having a male heir. Naturally, the solution wasn't introspection. It was annulment, excommunication, and the creation of an entirely new church. He invented Anglicanism just to date someone else. That's not devotion. That's pettiness with a cathedral. Enter Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. Henry wrote her love letters full of passion, obsession, and really bad poetry. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, but no sons. This led to her arrest for adultery, witchcraft, and possibly giving side-eye at court. She was beheaded. Henry moved on with the emotional range of a potato. Jane Seymour followed, producing a male heir, Edward, before tragically dying from childbirth complications. Henry mourned her deeply, by which we mean he waited a respectful 11 days before scoping out wife number 4. Next came Anne of Cleves, who Henry chose based on a flattering portrait. In person, he said she looked like a Flanders mare. That marriage lasted 6 months, and ended in what we'd now call a no-fault divorce and a politely written Yelp review. Catherine Howard, wife number 5, was much younger and considerably less discreet. She was executed for adultery, though honestly, it's hard to blame her. Being married to Henry at that point meant dealing with gout, paranoia, and a man who could barely walk, but still insisted he was a gift to women. Finally, Catherine Parr, wife 6, who wisely outlived him by being literate, patient, and excellent at dodging accusations. By the time Henry died, he'd bankrupted England, eaten half its livestock, and turned the royal court into a soap opera where heads rolled more often than wedding bands. In short, Henry VIII loved hard, ruled harder, and left a trail of drama so legendary it's still being turned into musicals. Francis I of France, ruling from 1515 to 1547, was the walking embodiment of the Renaissance. Cultured, charming, sophisticated, and absolutely incapable of keeping his trousers buttoned. To his credit, he was a great patron of the arts. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built magnificent palaces, and helped turn France into a cultural powerhouse. But while the painters were painting and the poets were poeting, Francis was busy seducing anything with a pulse and a title. His court was famous, or perhaps infamous, for its opulence, but also for being a kind of state-funded dating app. He employed gentlewomen of the bedchamber, a term that should have meant ladies-in-waiting, but really meant romantic shortlist. Entire political alliances were derailed because Francis accidentally bedded the ambassador's wife. And this wasn't quiet, subtle adultery. Francis was loud about it. He once declared to foreign dignitaries that French kings were expected to be excellent lovers, which is noble-sounding until you realise it came from a man who treated treaties and mistresses with the same level of commitment, which is to say, temporary. His most famous affair was with Françoise de Foix, a noblewoman who became his official mistress. She was witty, educated, and likely the only woman who could roast him in public and survive. Eventually replaced, because of course, she was followed by Anne de Pisseleu de Hailly, a woman whose name sounds like a medieval inside joke, and whose political influence was matched only by her ability to outlast the competition. Even his enemies couldn't help but notice. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, once described Francis as more dangerous in the bedroom than on the battlefield. He meant it as an insult. Francis probably took it as a compliment. And somehow, amid the affairs, banquets, and what can only be described as diplomatic flirtation, Francis still managed to rule effectively. Though his wars were expensive, and his taste in women even more so, the man was nothing if not enthusiastic. His reign was a whirlwind of silk, scandal, and second-hand perfume. Francis I wasn't just a king, he was France's most seductive historical liability, and honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. Alfonso XI of Castile ruled from 1311 to 1350, and he had one major hobby besides ruling a kingdom: ignoring his wife in the most public, extravagant way possible. His poor, politically strategic wife was Maria of Portugal, noble, well-connected, and unfortunately not Leonor de Guzman, the woman Alfonso actually cared about. Leonor was a Castilian noblewoman with a sharp mind, 11 children, and enough influence to basically run the court herself. And unlike Maria, she didn't need a crown to feel important. She just needed Alfonso's complete and shameless obsession. Now, most kings had mistresses. Alfonso turned his into a shadow queen. He built Leonor palaces, gave her land, took her everywhere. Meanwhile, Queen Maria was left sitting alone at royal events like an unwanted centrepiece, while Alfonso made googly eyes across the hall at his side chick, who was not even trying to be subtle about it. To make matters worse, or better, depending on your tolerance for medieval soap operas, Leonor wasn't just a mistress. She was politically active, negotiating treaties, commanding respect, and producing heirs like it was her full-time job. Which, let's be honest, it kind of was. Alfonso refused to even pretend Maria mattered. In fact, he only spent time with her once, and it was purely for diplomatic optics. After that, he retreated to Leonor's estate like a man allergic to marital obligations. This didn't sit well with Maria's dad, who happened to be the King of Portugal. At one point, international relations got so tense over the whole situation that a war nearly broke out. Imagine your in-laws being so mad about your mistress they consider military retaliation. But Alfonso didn't care. He continued parading Leonor around court like a royal trophy, and probably would have kept it up forever. If the Black Death hadn't killed him in 1350. That's right. It took a literal plague to end his affair. After Alfonso died, Queen Maria finally had her moment. She had Leonor imprisoned and executed in a move that historians call vengeful, and most of us would call extremely fair. Alfonso's reign may be remembered for military victories, but let's be real. His true legacy was being one of the most publicly whipped kings in medieval history. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, and no, not in the personality sense, ruled from 1285 to 1314. His nickname came from his good looks, which were unfortunately not matched by good behaviour. Outwardly, Philip was pious, serious, and all about moral reform. Inwardly, he was running a kingdom like it was a very tense reality show, complete with betrayal, secret trials, and a healthy dose of double standards, especially in the bedroom department. His most infamous scandal was the Tour de Nesle affair, a medieval sex scandal so messy it could have been scripted by HBO. It all started when Philip's daughter Isabella, yes, the same one who would later overthrow Edward II of England, noticed that her sisters-in-law were being a little too friendly with some knights. Suspiciously friendly. Like matching gift exchange and secret tower rendezvous friendly. Isabella tattled to Philip, who launched a royal investigation with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. 2 of the princesses, married to Philip's sons, were found guilty of adultery and publicly imprisoned for years, their heads shaved, their titles revoked, and their reputations completely annihilated. The 2 knights involved? Tortured, flayed, and executed in the public square. Because nothing says moral leadership like turning a family affair into a medieval snuff film. Now, here's where things get interesting. While Philip was handing out brutal punishments like candy, rumours swirled that he himself kept a few mistresses tucked away, in private rooms of the Louvre no less. Some whispered that he maintained a secret group of young women who were available to entertain visiting dignitaries. For diplomacy, of course. But unlike his daughters-in-law, nobody ever questioned the king's private affairs. Because when you're the one writing the rules, it's amazing how sin becomes strategy. Philip also had a special knack for using religion when convenient. He went after the Knights Templar for supposed heresy, but everyone knew it was about their money. It was the medieval equivalent of arresting your banker and calling it divine justice. So yes, Philip may have looked like a model of piety and honour. But behind that sculpted jawline and royal glare was a man with a deep commitment to hypocrisy, and a working knowledge of where all the castle's secret doors were. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, was the kind of man who collected crowns the way other men collected wine goblets, which he also collected, enthusiastically. Reigning from the late 14th to mid-15th century, Sigismund was smart, multilingual, and politically savvy. He also had a personal life so scandalous it would make a tavern bard blush. To begin with, Sigismund was married to Queen Mary of Hungary, a powerful woman in her own right. But marriage to Sigismund was more of a polite formality. He preferred his relationships less lawful, more frequent, and ideally not followed by conversation. His romantic side projects included noblewomen, laundresses, and at least one Italian opera singer, long before opera existed, which speaks to his innovative spirit. Court officials often lost track of his mistresses, not because there were so many, but because they changed so frequently. Some historians suggest they just started numbering them. At court, his mistresses had their own quarters, servants, and in one case, a private chapel, which is either deeply romantic or just wildly inappropriate, depending on how you feel about praying next to someone's mistress. Sigismund also had a fondness for disguises, particularly dressing as a commoner and sneaking into towns. Sometimes it was for espionage, sometimes to flirt with local women under the guise of being a very tall merchant. Apparently, nobody found this suspicious, despite him being the only merchant with a full entourage of servants wearing royal crests. And yet, the man ruled for decades, launched crusades, hosted the Council of Constance, and reformed imperial politics, all while carrying on affairs that would make even Casanova go, "Steady on, mate." One ambassador once wrote that Sigismund greets all women as equals, especially in private, which, while vaguely progressive, also sounded suspiciously like an HR violation. But despite his extracurriculars, Sigismund remained immensely popular, mostly because he managed to appear regal in public while quietly running the most chaotic love life in Europe. He wasn't just an emperor. He was a one-man renaissance, equal parts strategist, statesman, and scandal. And somehow, he always got away with it. Louis XV of France, known as Louis the Beloved, ruled from 1715 to 1774. And by ruled, we mostly mean he hosted an endless royal after-party where governance was optional and silk bed-sheets were not. He started out promising enough, young, handsome, and poised to carry on the legacy of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV. But somewhere around his 20s, Louis decided national policy could wait, because he had a long list of ladies-in-waiting to attend to. Let's talk about the Parc aux Cerfs, the quiet little house near Versailles that Louis used for, let's call them, private auditions. Girls were recruited, usually poor but pretty, brought in discreetly, and rotated like seasonal produce. There were so many mistresses, the palace guards likely had a clipboard system. His most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, wasn't just a pretty face. She basically ran France behind the scenes. But when she lost interest in the physical side of their relationship, Louis said, "That's fine," and built a second harem instead. The logic? Keep Pompadour for brains and banter. Keep the Parc aux Cerfs for everything else. It was all very organised chaos. Each girl received gifts, titles, and in some cases, discreet housing once their contract expired. It was France's most unofficial but strangely efficient internship programme. And the Queen, Marie Leszczyńska? She was around, somewhere, mostly ignored. Once she stopped having children, Louis treated her like antique furniture, too expensive to throw away but no longer relevant to the room. The scandal at court was so normalised that nobles didn't ask if the king had a mistress. They asked how many this week. Even foreign ambassadors gossiped in their letters about the turnover rate at Versailles. That's not a monarchy. That's a brothel with better uniforms. Ironically, Louis genuinely thought he was a good ruler, between lavish balls, discreet pregnancies, and awkward silences with his wife. His reign, while not catastrophic, set the tone for his grandson, Louis XVI, who would later lose his head, possibly because Grandpa spent too much time thinking with the wrong crown. In the end, Louis XV left behind a debt-ridden France, a disillusioned court, and a royal reputation that could best be summarised as loved by women, loathed by accountants. Christian VII of Denmark ruled from 1766 to 1808, though ruled might be too strong a word. Wobbled through life while other people ran the country is probably more accurate. You see, Christian had a few issues. He suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and was not particularly interested in the whole being king thing, unless it involved chasing servants with cutlery, which he apparently found hilarious. This made him more of a royal mascot than a monarch. Now Christian had a wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, a sensible young woman who expected a somewhat normal marriage. What she got was a husband who preferred masturbating in public, talking to his hand, and disappearing during state dinners to ride imaginary horses down palace corridors. It's unclear what broke first, her patience or his grasp on reality. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's physician. Smart, ambitious, and very interested in power, Struensee quickly became the real ruler of Denmark, and, somewhat awkwardly, the lover of the Queen. Yes, that's right. Caroline Matilda went full soap opera and began an affair with her husband's doctor. And the king did not notice or care. Struensee wrote the laws, signed the edicts, and kept Christian occupied with puppet shows, sword games, and gentle nudges away from sharp objects. It was perhaps the only love triangle in history where one corner was just vaguely humming to himself in the background. Caroline and Struensee even had a child together, possibly the king's on paper, definitely not his in practice. For a while, the two ran Denmark like a very progressive, slightly scandalous think tank, but royal courts are rarely chill places. Eventually, Christian's jealous mother-in-law got wind of the affair and staged a coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed, quite dramatically, while Caroline was shipped off to exile with her reputation in tatters. As for Christian, he returned to being a gently supervised liability, spending the rest of his reign in a kind of padded silence. His reign is remembered less for achievements and more for the sheer absurdity of it all. A king who ruled nothing, a queen who tried her best, and a physician who tried a little too hard. History calls it a constitutional crisis. We call it Europe's weirdest love story. Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, came back from exile with one clear agenda: bring back fun, preferably with as many mistresses as humanly possible. Spoiler: mission accomplished. After surviving a civil war, hiding in oak trees and living in continental poverty, Charles returned to England as king and promptly decided the nation needed a little less Puritanism and a little more clothing-optional ballroom dancing. Parliament reluctantly agreed. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, Charles had dozens of official mistresses, and those are just the ones we know about. His most famous flame was Nell Gwynn, a sharp-tongued actress who once called herself the Protestant whore, just to differentiate herself from all the other mistresses. Honestly, iconic branding. Then there was Barbara Palmer, titled Countess of Castlemaine, who was less mistress and more palace fixture. She was openly kept in royal apartments and had multiple children by Charles, all of whom were granted titles and land, because nepotism is more fun when it's flirty. Charles didn't even pretend to be discreet. He brought his mistresses to court events. He paid them government pensions. He even had a corridor built at Whitehall so they could reach his bedroom without disturbing the ambassadors. Efficiency. Thy name is Charles. Queen Catherine of Braganza, his long-suffering wife, endured it all with quiet dignity and possibly a flask. She bore no children, and Charles reportedly said, "She could not bear children, but she never gave me trouble," which is both a compliment and a red flag. Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, and acknowledged most of them, giving them noble titles and throwing elaborate birthday parties. Meanwhile, the legitimate line remained childless, as if karma had a sense of humour. Despite the scandals, Charles was popular. He reopened theatres, legalised fun, and restored monarchy with flair, wigs, and more eyeliner than his actresses. The people forgave him everything, mostly because he made monarchy look like a party. When he died, his final words were, "Let not poor Nelly starve," not "God bless England," not "Tell my brother to rule wisely," just "Feed the mistress." And that, friends, sums up Charles II, a king who governed like he was hosting a royal bachelor season finale. Eric XIV of Sweden ruled from 1560 to 1568. A short reign, but long enough to leave behind a legacy of paranoia, poetry, and utterly catastrophic dating choices. Now, Eric started out promising. Tall, handsome, fond of astronomy and the arts, the kind of king who might write you a love sonnet and then explain planetary orbits over dinner. He was also obsessed with astrology, so he rarely made decisions without checking the stars first. Unfortunately, the stars never told him to chill. Eric had a thing for noble women, but not in the subtle, whisper-in-a-garden kind of way. He proposed to Queen Elizabeth I of England multiple times, and she repeatedly declined, politely, then firmly, then with complete silence. Eric didn't get the hint and even sent portraits of himself as gifts, which is the 16th century equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs with a shirtless selfie and a marriage contract. After Elizabeth ghosted him, Eric set his sights lower, in rank, not enthusiasm. He fell for Karin Mundsdotter, a commoner and the daughter of a jailer. This scandalised the nobility, which only made Eric dig in harder. He married her, crowned her queen, and then spent the next year having emotional breakdowns, imprisoning nobles, and stabbing people he thought looked at her funny. His most infamous moment? The Stura murders. A casual dinner party that ended with Eric personally killing a noble with a knife while shouting things that made his courtiers question whether astrology had finally broken his brain. By this point, he was hearing voices, hiding from invisible enemies, and occasionally dressing in disguise to spy on his own council. The nobility staged an intervention, which, in royal terms, means they locked him in a castle and handed the crown to his brother. Eric spent the rest of his life imprisoned, writing bizarre love poetry to Karin, occasionally ranting about conspiracies, and probably regretting stabbing that guy mid-supper. Sweden learned a few things from Eric's reign. Always check your dinner guests for hidden blades, avoid kings who write their own horoscopes, and maybe, just maybe, don't crown the man who insists the moon is whispering about betrayal. Ferdinand I of Naples, also known as Ferdinand of Aragon, ruled from the mid-15th century and brought with him a rare blend of charm, brutality, and a hobby that would make most people cancel dinner plans immediately. On the surface, Ferdinand was a cultured and efficient ruler. He stabilised his kingdom, balanced the budget, and crushed rebellions with impressive speed. But his leadership style leaned heavily into friendly dictator with a side of psychological warfare. Case in point, his approach to enemies. Most kings exiled traitors, some imprisoned them. Ferdinand, he preferred to stuff them. Yes, taxidermy, of humans. After executing rebellious nobles, he had them embalmed and displayed in a private museum underneath his castle. It was called the Black Room, and he gave guided tours to foreign dignitaries, visiting ambassadors, and even potential traitors. Nothing says behave yourself like showing someone your haul of preserved political mistakes. He reportedly enjoyed describing each corpse by name, crime, and expression. Some were posed mid-scream, others had plaques. One guest fainted. Ferdinand found it hilarious. If TripAdvisor had existed, the reviews would have been 5 stars, deeply unsettling, would not return without sedative. Now, when he wasn't curating the creepiest gallery in Europe, Ferdinand had an equally questionable romantic reputation. He fathered numerous illegitimate children, many of whom mysteriously popped up with titles and land. His official queen was just one lady among many, and it's suspected that Ferdinand saw marriage as more of a suggestion than a rule. His mistresses ranged from noblewomen to peasants, with the only common factor being his complete disregard for discretion. Royal banquets sometimes doubled as flirtation contests. One ambassador noted that Ferdinand never dined without sampling from multiple courses, political and otherwise. And yet, despite all this, Ferdinand remained popular. His people admired his strength. Nobles feared him. And visiting enemies, upon seeing the Black Room, quickly lost interest in rebellion. He ruled for decades, died in his bed, and passed the kingdom to his legitimate-ish heirs. Ferdinand's legacy? A stable kingdom, a terrifying basement, and the firm understanding that some kings build alliances, others collect warning signs in glass cases. The year was 1119. The dust of the First Crusade still clung to the broken stones of Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims were flocking to the Holy Land in droves, believing the sacred city was now safe. But outside the city walls, it was chaos. Bandits prowled the roads. Muslim warbands struck caravans, and travellers were butchered or sold into slavery. The dream of Christian safety in the East was collapsing. That's when a knight named Gilles de Rais, along with 8 companions, made a vow. Not to a king, not to a lord, but to God. They pledged to protect Christian pilgrims with their lives, not just as soldiers, but as monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. No wives, no gold, no lands, just horses, swords, and faith. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A mouthful, yes, but that final phrase mattered, because King Baldwin II gave them quarters on the Temple Mount, where the ruins of Solomon's temple stood. From this holy ground, they took their name, the Knights Templar. For 9 years they remained a tiny group, unofficial, underfunded, and dangerously committed. They lived like beggars, borrowing armour, sharing war horses, training like maniacs. But they were disciplined, devout, dangerous, and their reputation began to spread. It wasn't long before their strange blend of monk and warrior caught the attention of one of the most influential men in Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was no ordinary abbot. He was a spiritual rock star. When he spoke, popes listened, and he saw something divine in these men. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, he helped draft the official rule of the Templars, a rigid monastic code infused with martial purpose. He praised them as the new knighthood, a holy elite who fought not for glory, but for God. With Bernard's blessing and the Pope's approval, the Knights Templar were no longer just a desperate band of misfits. They became a religious order with divine sanction. Donations flowed in. Young nobles abandoned comfortable lives to join their ranks. From the dirt of Jerusalem, the Templars were rising, holy, hungry, and now officially unstoppable. But they had no idea that their greatest blessing, papal independence, would one day mark them for death. With papal recognition secured and their white mantles stitched with blood-red crosses, the Knights Templar weren't just monks with swords anymore. They were the shock troops of Christendom. The Crusader states in the Levant, fragile Christian outposts in a sea of Islamic resistance, were constantly under threat, and the Templars were now the wall that held the tide. Their code was brutal but clear: never retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. No ransoms, no mercy, no fear. They trained daily, fought with fanatical discipline, and believed death in battle was the highest honour. While most knights fought for plunder and pride, the Templars fought with a terrifying sense of righteousness. They were God's fury on horseback. In the Second Crusade, they proved their worth. While disorganised lords bickered and failed to capture Damascus, the Templars maintained discipline and carved through enemy lines. In skirmishes and open battles, their charges became legendary. It wasn't just their skill, it was their reputation. Muslim commanders began identifying them first in battle reports. Those white-mantled devils with the red cross. They didn't just fight, they fortified. Across the Holy Land, the Templars built an iron web of castles and outposts, Safed, Tortosa, and the mighty fortress of Bagras. These were no ornamental estates. Templar castles were militarised strongholds with thick walls, trap-laden gates, and water systems designed to withstand year-long sieges. When armies fled, Templars stayed behind to buy time or die. But their allegiance was not to kings. not to emperors, only to the Pope. And that made them a rare breed, one that rulers both admired and feared. A king could not command them, a baron could not bribe them. Only the Grand Master, chosen from within, could give the order to fight or stand down. They were sovereign in spirit, even as they bled for the cross. And they weren't just recruiting soldiers, they were building a myth. Their ceremonies were secret, their rites austere, their discipline absolute. To many, they were holy, to others, ominous. And yet, their popularity only grew. They had transformed from 9 dusty knights into an elite order spanning continents. But with fame came whispers, and with whispers came envy. The sword of God had become sharp, but someday it would be pointed at them. They began with borrowed armour and a vow of poverty. But within a century, the Knights Templar weren't just warriors. They were the world's most trusted financial institution. They didn't set out to become bankers. War made them rich. Faith made them trusted. And necessity made them brilliant. It started with donations. Nobles eager to support the Holy Land gifted them land, gold, livestock, even entire villages. The Templars didn't just hoard it, they managed it, carefully, strategically. They built commanderies across Europe, agricultural estates run like efficient businesses. Everything was accounted for: grain, livestock, taxes, tithes. A monk in England could be sending money to support a battle in Jerusalem within weeks. That kind of reach was unheard of. Then came the banking system. A nobleman heading to the Holy Land no longer needed to risk carrying a chest of coins. He could deposit funds with the Templars in Paris, receive a coded letter, and withdraw the same amount in Acre. It was one of the earliest forms of international banking. Templars charged modest fees, kept meticulous records, and never defaulted. They became the Swiss banks of the medieval world, centuries before Switzerland even existed. Their clients? Kings, queens, bishops, and merchants. They safeguarded the French crown jewels, managed papal finances, funded crusades, ransomed prisoners. In some cases, they even lent money to the very monarchs who would later try to destroy them. The Templars didn't flaunt their wealth. They weren't draped in silk or gold. Their churches were plain, their vestments humble. But beneath that austerity was an empire of ledgers, vaults, and armoured wagons, an invisible hand that touched nearly every economy in Europe. And yet, they refused to call themselves bankers. They were monks. Everything they did, they claimed, was in service of God. But the more gold they moved, the more enemies they made. The Church turned a blind eye. After all, the Templars answered only to the Pope. But kings grew nervous. They owed the Templars fortunes, and couldn't control them. What began as a mission to defend pilgrims had evolved into something stranger. They were warriors with no battlefield, monks with no monastery, bankers with no kingdom, and while their coffers grew heavier, so did the weight of suspicion. Power without oversight? That's when kings start sharpening knives. For all their might, the Templars were fighting a losing war. The Crusader states, Outremer, were castles in the sand, constantly battered by the waves of Islamic resurgence. And leading that tide was Saladin, the brilliant Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Unlike the disorganized and often petty Crusader lords, Saladin was a unifying force. And he had one goal: retake Jerusalem. In 1187, that goal was realized at the Battle of Hattin. The Templars were there, fighting to the last. But they were crushed, outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and surrounded in the searing heat. The Christian army was annihilated. Saladin captured hundreds of knights. Most were ransomed. But when it came to the Templars, no mercy. He executed nearly all of them. To Saladin, they were too dangerous to keep alive. The loss of Jerusalem wasn't just a military blow. It was a spiritual crisis. The city they had sworn to protect was gone. The Holy Sepulchre was back in Muslim hands. And with it, the Templars' original purpose had begun to crumble. Still, they regrouped. The Third Crusade brought reinforcements and Richard the Lionheart, who respected and relied on the Templars in battle, but even he couldn't retake Jerusalem. Over the next century, the Crusader states shrank like dying embers. One by one, cities fell: Antioch, Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291. The last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land was lost. They retreated to Cyprus, where they built new headquarters and tried to maintain relevance. But something had shifted. They were still warriors, but with no Holy Land left to defend. What were they fighting for? Their castles stood empty. Their legends grew dusty. Their discipline, once their hallmark, began to fade. At the same time, rival orders like the Hospitallers gained ground. Accusations of pride, corruption, and arrogance followed the Templars across Europe. Some whispered they had grown too rich, too secretive. Others said they were hoarding relics, dangerous ones. The East had shaped them, forged them, broken them. And now without it the Templars were adrift. They still had their wealth, their network, their aura of power. But they had lost the thing that made them essential: a sword with no war, a brotherhood with no crusade. And in that vacuum, powerful enemies were watching. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Knights Templar were still rich, still feared, and still powerful. But for the first time in their history, they were also irrelevant. The Holy Land was lost. No more crusades were on the horizon. They had become a military order with no war, a religious order with no clear mission, and a financial powerhouse that answered to no king, and that made them a target. No one eyed them with more suspicion or greed than King Philip IV of France. Known as Philip the Fair, he wasn't called fair for his sense of justice. He was deep in debt, bankrupt from wars with England and Flanders. And the Templars? They were his creditors. He had borrowed massive sums from them to fund his armies and keep his throne. But Philip didn't like being in debt, especially to men he couldn't control. Worse, the Templars were politically independent. They answered only to the Pope, not to the crown. They held land in France but paid no taxes to the king. They had their own fortresses, their own courts, their own armies. To Philip they were a dangerous state within his state, untouchable, immovable, and unbearably rich. So he began planning. Philip's propaganda machine got to work. Rumours spread that the Templars worshipped idols, spat on the cross, performed obscene initiation rites. No evidence, just whispers. But in an age of superstition, whispers were enough. He leaned on his puppet pope, Clement V, pressuring the papacy to investigate. Clement hesitated, but Philip wasn't waiting. In secret, Philip orchestrated one of the most coordinated mass arrests in medieval history. He set a date, gathered his soldiers, prepared his torturers. And on one cold Friday morning in October 1307, Friday the 13th, he struck. All across France, Templar knights were seized, interrogated, imprisoned, tortured. Confessions were forced. Some broke within hours. Others resisted until their bodies did. It was treason wrapped in holy justice, and it worked. The public, once loyal, began to turn. The Pope, pressured and humiliated, found himself cornered. The tide had turned not in battle, but in politics. And the warrior monks who once rode into enemy lines now sat chained in dungeons, accused of sins that no sword could defend. October 13th, 1307. The day that forever cursed Friday the 13th in the Western imagination. At dawn, across every corner of France, armed men moved in silence. Their orders were clear. Arrest every Templar you can find. No warning, no resistance allowed. The king's justice had arrived, with swords drawn and warrants sealed in secrecy. Thousands of knights were dragged from their beds, some in full armour, others in prayer. Grandmaster Jacques de Molay was taken in Paris, betrayed by the very kingdom whose crown jewels he had once safeguarded. Across cities and countryside, Templar commanderies were raided, their vaults cracked open, and their libraries seized. The charges were fantastical: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, sodomy, devil rituals. Most of it was invented whole cloth by Philip's lawyers. But in an era of fear and religious zealotry, it didn't need to be true. It just needed to be believable. And the Templars? They were silenced with fire and iron. Torture chambers lit up across France. Men were stretched, burned, crushed, flayed, until their confessions dripped from them like blood. They admitted to whatever their inquisitors wanted: that they denied Christ, that they worshipped a severed head named Baphomet, that they kissed one another in secret